The hand that held the hammer was a map of old fences and hard winters, the knuckles like worn river stones and the skin cracked as dry creek beds. It rose and fell with a rhythm that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with patience. The flat, ringing sound of steel on steel, a lonely punctuation in the vast, heat-shimmered silence of the afternoon. Silas did not rush the work because the wire did not rush and the post did not rush. And the sun that baked the back of his neck into dark leather certainly took its own deliberate time moving across the sky. He set the staple, its two sharp points biting into the weathered gray wood of the post he'd sunk that morning, and with two precise blows, he drove it home, seating it deep enough to hold against a spooked steer or a season of wind, but not so deep as to crush the wire's own stubborn life. He tested the tension with his thumb, feeling the tight, musical hum that meant it was done right, a low note that vibrated back through his arm and settled somewhere deep in his chest. It was a good feeling. It was enough. He straightened his back, a slow uncoiling of muscle and bone that came with a familiar protest from his lower spine, and he surveyed the line he'd run. It stretched a quarter-mile south, wavering in the rising heat but true in its course, a thin, dark scar drawn across the pale, sun-bleached grass of his property. Beyond it, to the west, lay the Breckenridge place, though no one had called it that in years. It was just the Dust Bowl now, a testament to a man's failed ambition and the land's final, indifferent victory. The small house sagged in on itself, its porch slanted like a drunkard's grin, and the barn had long ago given up the ghost, its spine broken by a winter storm. Silas remembered for the way the snow had fallen, without wind, a heavy, suffocating blanket that had simply crushed whatever was too weak to bear its weight. The well was a circle of broken stones, a dry throat choked with tumbleweeds. It was a place of endings, a place the sun baked a little harder and the wind scoured a little cleaner, as if trying to erase a mistake. For 5 years, it had sat empty, a silent neighbor whose decay was as constant and predictable as the turning of the seasons. Silas had grown used to its silence, its stillness. It was a mirror, in a way, to the quiet he had cultivated in his own life, a life pared down to the necessities of work and weather and the slow turning of his own thoughts. His days were marked by a simple liturgy of tasks. Dawn was for the stock, the breaking of ice in the trough in winter, or the slow walk to the far pasture in summer. Morning was for mending, a loose board on the corral, a worn strap on a saddle, a fence line pushed down by antelope. The heat of the afternoon was for the shade of the porch, for the slow work of cleaning a rifle or sharpening a blade, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel a kind of meditation. Evening was for the quiet of his small cabin, the smell of coffee and bacon, the low light of a kerosene lamp painting flickering shadows on the plain wood walls. He had built the cabin himself, in the barn and the fences, and in the building of them, he had built a life that fit him. A life that did not ask questions or demand answers he did not have. He had come here to be forgotten, not by anyone in particular, but by the man he used to be, the man who had worn a star and carried the weight of other people's troubles until they had become his own. The weight was gone, but a hollowness remained, and he filled that hollowness with the simple, solid reality of the land. The land did not judge, it simply was. It demanded work, and it gave back just enough to continue the work. It was a fair trade. He asked for nothing more. The town of Redemption was a day's ride east, and he went only when he had to, for flour and salt and cartridges. He would stand in the general store, a tall, quiet man who smelled of leather and dust, and he would listen to the talk. He learned more from listening than he ever had from speaking. He heard about the price of cattle, about the lack of rain, about the way the world beyond their small valley was changing in ways that made men nervous, and he heard about the Breckenridge place. He heard the speculation, the casual dismissals. Land's cursed, one would say, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Broke old Breckenridge's heart and his back, another would nod. Only a fool would buy it. Silas would gather his supplies, pay in coin, and ride out, the talk fading behind him, just another sound in a world full of noise he preferred to leave behind. He had seen what foolishness and hope could do to a man. He had seen it in his own mirror once. Now, he preferred the company of fences. A fence knew its purpose. It stood its ground. It kept things in, and it kept things out. It was a simple, honest declaration. This is mine. That is yours. There was a peace in that clarity. He finished his work as the sun began to dip, painting the undersides of the few thin clouds in strokes of orange and bruised purple. He gathered his tools, the familiar weight of them in his hands a comfort, and walked back toward his cabin, his shadow stretching long and thin behind him. He did not look at the Breckenridge place again. He knew it would be there tomorrow, just as ruined, just as empty. The world had a certain order to it, and the slow, steady decay of a forgotten place was part of that order. The coyotes would cry that night, their voices thin and sharp, and the wind would whisper through the broken panes of the empty house, and Silas would sleep the dreamless sleep of a man who expects nothing to change. He was wrong. Afternoon. The wagon was what he saw first. A small, rickety thing pulled by a single sway-backed mule that looked as tired as the land itself. It crawled along the dusty track that led to the Breckenridge place, kicking up a plume of dust that hung in the still air long after it passed. Silas watched from his porch, his chair tilted back against the cabin wall, a cup of coffee held loosely in his hand. He had seen traveling peddlers and lost prospectors take that road before, only to turn back when they saw the state of the place. But this wagon did not turn back. It pulled right up to the sagging porch of the ruined house and stopped. A figure climbed down. It was small, dressed in dark, strange clothes, and moved with a delicacy that seemed entirely out of place in the harsh landscape. It was a woman. He watched as she stood there for a long time, just looking at the house, a small, still shape against the vast, empty backdrop of the plains. She did not seem dismayed or disappointed. She simply looked, as if she were reading a page in a book. Then, she turned her attention to the broken well, and then to the collapsed barn. Finally, she walked to the edge of the property. Her property now, he supposed, and looked across the newly mended fence toward his own cabin. He did not move. He just watched. The distance was too great to see her face, but he could feel the weight of her gaze, the quiet assessment. After a moment, she turned and went back to the wagon, beginning the slow, methodical work of unloading her meager possessions. Days later, the town knew her name, Mei Lin, a widow, they said, from the coast, Chinese. The word was spoken in the general store with a mixture of curiosity and contempt, a verbal pebble flicked at something strange and unwelcome. Bought the dust bowl sight unseen, Miller, the store owner, said, weighing out a sack of beans for a rancher. Paid cash. Can you imagine? The rancher grunted. What's one of her kind want with a place like that? Can't run it. The talk eddied and flowed around her, a current of suspicion. She kept to herself, which they took for arrogance. She worked from sunup to sundown, which they took for desperation. Silas saw it himself. He saw her trying to clear the rubble from the barn, her movements slow but persistent, carrying rocks one by one. He saw her trying to patch the roof of the house with scraps of tin and canvas. And he saw her spend 3 straight days at the well, hauling up bucket after bucket of dirt and debris, her small frame straining with the effort. She never seemed to rest. The work was impossible, a single person against years of neglect and decay. But she met it each day with the same quiet, relentless determination. She did not ask for help, and no one offered it. She was an island, and the town was the water that surrounded her, indifferent and vast. Silas found himself watching her more than he watched his own stock. He would stand at his fence line in the evenings, watching the small, solitary light of her lamp flicker to life in one of the house's dark windows. He felt a strange kinship with her isolation, a recognition of the wall she had built around herself. His was made of silence and routine. Hers was made of work and a kind of profound otherness that the town could not, or would not, see past. One morning, he saw that the handle of the well's windlass had broken. He watched her struggle with it, trying to rig a rope, her efforts failing. He went into his workshop, found a spare length of seasoned oak, and in the cool of the afternoon, he shaped a new handle, sanding it smooth, fitting it with a new iron pin. He did not think about why he was doing it. The work was simply there to be done. That evening, after the sun had set and the moon was a pale sliver in the sky, he walked across the dead grass, unlatched the gate between their properties, and approached the well. He worked in silence, the only sounds the tap of his hammer and the rasp of the file. He fitted the new handle, tested its action. It turned smoothly, the rope coiling as it should. He left it there, a silent offering, and walked back to his own land, latching the gate behind him. He did not see her, but he knew she was watching from the dark window. The next day, when he looked out, he saw a small clay bowl sitting on the fence post between their properties. Inside were 2 perfect pale green melons. He took them back to his cabin. He ate one for his supper. It was sweet and cool, and tasted of a gratitude that needed no words. That night, the sheriff came. Silas saw the dust from his horse long before he arrived, and he was waiting on his porch when Sheriff Thorne reined in. Thorne was a man who wore his authority like a well-tailored coat, comfortable and close-fitting. He had a politician's smile that never quite reached his eyes, and a way of looking at a man's property as if he were already calculating its value at auction. "Silas," he said, swinging down from his horse. He didn't offer a handshake. "Been a while." "Thorn," Silas replied, his voice level. He didn't invite him to sit. Thorn's gaze drifted past Silas toward the neighboring ranch, where Maylene's small lamp was a lonely spark against the encroaching darkness. "Got yourself a new neighbor," he said, his tone casual, but with a hard edge beneath it. "Heard some strange stories." Silas said nothing. He just waited. Silence was his oldest friend. Thorn leaned against the porch rail, taking a cigar from his pocket. "Town's a little concerned. A woman like that, alone, on a place that broke a good man. It ain't right. Ain't safe." "She seems to be managing," Silas said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "Managing?" Thorn chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "She's trying to draw water from a dead well and living in a house that's half dirt. That ain't managing. That's a problem waiting to happen. A problem I'll have to clean up." He lit his cigar, the flare of the match illuminating his face, the sharp planes, and the cold, watchful eyes. "I paid her a visit this afternoon. Offered to take the place off her hands. For a fair price, of course. For her own good. She could go back to wherever she came from, be with her own people." "What did she say?" Silas asked, though he already knew. "She said no." Thorn blew a plume of smoke into the night air. "Stubborn. Doesn't understand how things work out here. Some people need to be protected from themselves." He looked directly at Silas then, his smile gone. "I hear you've been neighborly, fixing her well." The words were a statement, but they landed like a question, an accusation. "The handle was broken," Silas said. "I fixed it." "Right." Thorn straightened up, tossing the half-smoked cigar into the dust. "Just be careful, Silas. Entanglements get messy. People get the wrong idea. A man like you, wanting to be left alone, you wouldn't want the town thinking you've taken a special interest. You wouldn't want them thinking you're her protector." The threat was as plain as the star on his chest, polished and cold. "She's on her own," Thorn finished, climbing back onto his horse. "Best for everyone if it stays that way." He rode off, leaving the smell of cheap cigar smoke and unspoken warnings hanging in the air. Silas stood on the porch for a long time after he was gone, watching the small, distant light in Maylene's window. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. It was a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. It was the feeling of a storm gathering on a clear day. Weeks later, the whispers started. They began in the saloon, fueled by whiskey and suspicion, and they spread like a grass fire, carried on the wind to every corner of the valley. Gold. The word itself was a fever. Someone, a drifter passing through, had claimed that old man Breckenridge wasn't just broke. He was a miser. He hadn't trusted banks. He'd found a rich vein on his property, right under the house, and had been secretly hoarding the dust, hiding it somewhere nobody would think to look. The story was wild, unsubstantiated, the kind of tale that usually dies with the morning's hangover. But this one didn't die. It grew. And soon, the story had a new detail, a new focus. The well. Breckenridge had hidden his treasure at the bottom of the dry well. Sheriff Thorn did nothing to quell the rumors. In fact, he seemed to nurture them. He would be seen in the general store, shaking his head with a look of practiced concern. "A terrible temptation," he'd say to the assembled men. "All that wealth, just sitting there, and that poor woman, all alone. She wouldn't know how to handle it. It would bring nothing but trouble. Vultures would descend." He made it sound like a civic duty, a burden he was reluctant to bear. He was protecting her, he said, protecting the town from the chaos that would surely follow. The nature of the visits to Maylene's ranch changed. Thorn no longer came alone. He brought his deputy, a young, eager man named Cale, whose loyalty was as shiny and unthinking as his badge. They would ride onto her property without asking, their horses trampling the small, struggling garden she had managed to cultivate near the house. Silas would watch from his fence line as Thorn spoke to her, his posture one of paternalistic authority, his hands gesturing toward the well, toward the house, his voice too low to carry, but his intent as clear as glass. He was pressuring her, squeezing her. Each time they left, Maylene would stand by her door for a long time, her back ramrod straight, her small figure looking impossibly fragile against the backdrop of her decaying home. But she did not bend. She did not break. Silas saw the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders when she thought no one was watching, but he also saw the iron in her spine when Thorn was there. She had a strength that was quieter and deeper than the sheriff's blustering power. It was the strength of a root in rock, a thing that holds on not through force, but through sheer, unyielding persistence. One afternoon, Silas rode into Redemption for supplies. The atmosphere was different. The usual lazy gossip had been replaced by a tense, focused energy. Men stood in small groups, their eyes constantly drifting toward the west, toward the Dust Bowl. He saw Thorn standing on the steps of the sheriff's office, talking to a man in a dusty suit. A land agent from the capital, Silas guessed. Thorn saw him, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. He nodded at Silas, a gesture of condescending acknowledgement, as if they were partners in a secret he was about to reveal. Silas ignored him, tying his horse in front of the general store. Inside, the air was thick with the rumor. "Heard Thorn made her a final offer," one man was saying, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. $500 for the whole spread. More than she paid, he says. A generous offer, under the circumstances. "She'd be a fool not to take it," another added. "With that much gold down there? It ain't hers by right. She just stumbled into it. Thorn's the law. He'll see it distributed fairly." Silas felt a cold anger rise in him. Fairly. He knew what Thorn's fairness looked like. It looked like a deed signed under duress. A legal theft wrapped in the flag of civic duty. He bought his flour and salt, his hands moving with their usual economy, but his mind was far away. He was seeing the sheriff's confident smile, the casual cruelty in his eyes. He was seeing Maylene's small, defiant figure standing against the weight of it all. He rode home slowly, the sun hot on his shoulders. He thought about his own carefully constructed peace, the quiet life he had built from the wreckage of his past. He had come here to avoid this very thing. He had drawn his lines, mended his fences, and asked only to be left to his own small patch of earth. To interfere was to invite the world back in, the world of noise and trouble and complicated loyalties. To interfere was to become the man he had tried so hard to forget. But as he rode, he kept seeing the bowl on the fence post, the two pale green melons inside. A simple, silent exchange, a recognition. This is mine, that is yours. And sometimes, a fence wasn't enough. Sometimes, a line had to be defended, not with wire and posts, but with a choice. He looked toward her ranch as he approached his own. Thorn's horse was tied to her porch rail, alongside the deputy's. This time, they hadn't just stopped to talk. The deputy, Cale, was nailing a piece of paper to her door, an eviction notice. Silas could see the official lettering even from a distance. He saw Maylin standing on the porch, motionless, her hands clasped in front of her. Thorn was speaking to her, his back to Silas, but his posture was dismissive, final. He had played his game, and he had won. The law was on his side. The town was on his side. She was alone. Silas stopped his horse at his own gate. He sat there for a long moment, the reins loose in his hands, the silence of the plains pressing in on him. He could turn his horse, ride to his cabin, and shut the door. He could close his eyes to it. In a week, she would be gone, and the Breckenridge place would be empty again, its silence restored. His own peace would be undisturbed, nothing would have changed, and everything would have changed. He looked at the notice on the door, a white scar on the weathered wood. He looked at Thorn, a man convinced of his own power. And he looked at Maylin, who had asked for nothing, who had faced the impossible with a quiet grace that shamed them all. He thought of the fence he had mended that first day. A line, a declaration. He swung his leg over the saddle, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. The sound was small, insignificant in the vastness of the landscape, but it was a decision. He walked toward the gate between their properties, his steps slow, deliberate, measured. He did not know what he would say. He did not know what he would do. He only knew that he could not stand on his side of the fence any longer. Not today. He unlatched the gate, the familiar wooden click loud in the charged silence, and walked onto her land. Thorn heard it and turned, his expression shifting from smug satisfaction to annoyance, then to a cold, hard watchfulness. The deputy, Cale, stopped his hammering, his hand frozen in midair. They both looked at Silas, a tall, dusty figure walking steadily toward them, his face unreadable, his hands empty at his sides. He did not look at them. His eyes were on Maylin. She stood perfectly still, but as he drew closer, he saw the faint tremor in her hands, the only sign of the strain she was under. He stopped beside her on the porch, standing just a half step in front of her, a silent, solid presence at her shoulder. He still had not spoken a word. "Silas," Thorn said, his voice tight with irritation, This is official county business. It doesn't concern you. You should go on back to your place. Silas finally turned his gaze to the sheriff. He looked at the man's confident face, at the badge pinned to his chest, and then at the paper nailed to the door. His eyes scanned the legal text, the signatures, the official seal. He had seen hundreds of documents like it in his former life. He knew their language, their weaknesses. This notice gives her 30 days, Silas said, his voice quiet, but carrying in the still air. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Thorne's eyes narrowed. The 30 days are a formality. For her own safety, she needs to vacate the premises immediately. The situation has become unstable. I'm acting in the interest of public order. Whose order? Silas asked, his gaze unwavering. There's no gold, Thorne. It was a shot in the dark, a guess born of a deep-seated distrust of men who wrapped their greed in the language of the common good. He saw a flicker of something in the sheriff's eyes, surprise, anger, and he knew he'd hit the mark. The gold was a lie. It was a tool, a pretext for a land grab, a story to turn the town's envy into a weapon Thorne could aim. That's a wild accusation, Thorne blustered, recovering quickly. The claim is credible, and until it's verified, this land is a site of potential dispute. The county is securing it. You're securing it, Silas corrected him, his voice still low, still calm. You found a piece of paper that said Breckenridge owed back taxes, a debt you were happy to ignore when the land was worthless. You bought the debt for pennies from the county clerk, your cousin, I'd wager. Now you're using it to foreclose. It's a clean, legal theft. Each word was laid down like a stone, carefully placed, building a wall Thorne hadn't expected. The sheriff's face hardened, the mask of civic concern falling away to reveal the cold ambition beneath. You've been spending too much time alone, Silas. It's made you crazy. Now I'm telling you for the last time, stand aside. No, Silas said. The word was not loud, but it filled the space between them, absolute and unyielding. He turned his head slightly, just enough to speak to Mei Lin without taking his eyes off the sheriff. Ma'am, is this your property? She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. She had been a silent witness to it all, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. But now, someone had asked her a question. Someone was acknowledging her place in it all. After a long moment, she gave a single, sharp nod. Her voice, when it came, was clear and steady, without a trace of fear. It is. Silas looked back at Thorne. You heard her? He said. This is her home. Your paper gives her 30 days. She'll take them. You and your boy can come back then, if your paperwork is still in order. He took a small step forward, closing the distance between himself and the sheriff, until they were barely a foot apart. He was taller than Thorne, and in that moment, the quiet rancher seemed to possess an authority that had nothing to do with a badge, and everything to do with a conviction that was as solid as the earth beneath his feet. But you won't be coming on her land again before then. Not without a better reason. That's not a request. The deputy, Cale, looked nervously from Silas to his boss, his hand hovering near the butt of his pistol. But Thorne did not reach for his gun. He was a bully, not a fool. He thrived on intimidation and the weight of assumed authority, but he knew a line he could not cross when he saw one. And Silas was that line. He saw something in Silas's eyes, a stillness, a depth of experience that warned him this was not a fight he could win with bluster. To force the issue would be to risk an escalation he couldn't control, and to do it in front of his deputy would be to risk his authority in a way that was far more permanent than a temporary setback. Thorne held Silas's gaze for a long, silent moment, the air crackling with unspoken violence. Then, with a look of pure venom, he gave a curt nod to his deputy. Take the notice down, he snarled. She has her 30 days. He turned, strode to his horse, and swung himself into the saddle without looking back. Cale hastily ripped the paper from the door, leaving 2 small holes in the wood, and scurried after his boss. They rode away, their departure as sudden as their arrival, leaving a cloud of dust and a profound, ringing silence behind them. Silas did not watch them go. He stood on the porch, listening to the sound of the hoofbeats fade into the distance. The tension slowly drained out of him, leaving him feeling weary, exposed. He had stepped across a line, and he knew there was no stepping back. He turned to Mei Lin. She was looking at him, her expression one of profound, searching quiet. The wall she kept around herself had a crack in it, and for the first time, he saw the exhaustion and the fear she had held at bay for so long. But he also saw a flicker of something else. Gratitude, understanding. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He just nodded, uncomfortable with the words, with the weight of the moment. He looked at the two small holes in her door where the notice had been. He thought of all the things that were broken: the barn, the well, the trust between neighbors. He looked at her, and he saw not a fragile outsider, but a woman of formidable strength who had been asked to bear too much alone. "The roof," he said, his voice rough. "The west side looks weak. I have some lumber. I'll bring it over in the morning." It was all he could think to say. It was an offer of work, a return to the solid, understandable world of mending things. She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she nodded. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "I will make tea," she said. That night, for the first time in years, Silas did not sleep a dreamless sleep. He dreamed of his past, of the star on his chest, and the weight of a gun on his hip. But it was different this time. The memories were not ghosts that haunted him, but roads that had led him here, to this porch, to this choice. He woke before dawn, the dream fading, but its feeling lingering, a sense of rightness, of a purpose he hadn't realized he'd been missing. He did not question it. He simply rose, made his coffee, and went to his lumber pile as the first pale light of morning broke over the horizon. The work was waiting. Days later, the sound of a hammer no longer echoed from just one side of the fence line. It came from both. Silas and Mei Lin worked on the barn roof, a slow and steady reclamation. He showed her how to brace the main beam, how to measure and cut the planks, his movements economical and precise. She learned quickly, her hands small but deft, her focus absolute. They worked mostly in silence, a comfortable quiet punctuated by the simple language of the task at hand. Hold this steady, or a little to the left. Their silence was not empty. It was filled with a shared understanding, a partnership forged not in words, but in the common effort of building something against the entropy of the world. In the heat of the afternoon, they would rest in the shade of the repaired porch, and she would bring out 2 cups of tea, its scent fragrant and unfamiliar. They would drink, looking out over the land, her land, and Silas would feel a sense of peace that was different from the solitary quiet he had known before. It was a peace that was shared. The town watched, of course, from a distance. The story of the confrontation with Thorn had spread, losing and gaining details in the telling, but the core of it remained. Silas, the quiet man, had stood up, and Thorn had backed down. No one knew quite what to make of it. Thorn's power had been built on the assumption of his own authority, an authority the town had passively accepted. Now, that assumption had been challenged, and a seed of doubt had been planted. Thorn stayed away. The rumors of gold withered and died, deprived of the sheriff's nurturing attention, and the town's fever broke, leaving behind a residue of sheepish embarrassment. Life in Redemption returned to its usual rhythms, but something had shifted, subtly and permanently. A line had been redrawn. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat on the porch as the sun went down. The barn was no longer a skeleton. It was a structure, solid and sound. The well, cleared and cleaned, now drew sweet, cold water. A small flock of chickens scratched in the dirt near the house, their clucking a sound of stubborn, persistent life. Mei Lin had brought out a bowl of rice and vegetables, and they ate together, the day's work settling into a pleasant ache in their muscles. "Why?" she asked, her voice soft in the twilight. She did not need to explain the question. Silas looked out at the fence that separated their properties, the fence he had so carefully mended. "A fence is meant to keep things out," he said, thinking it through as he spoke. "But sometimes it's just there to show you where you stand, and where your neighbor stands. It's no good if you don't honor the line." She was quiet for a moment, then she nodded, as if he had said everything that needed to be said. He would spend a long time afterward wondering about the truth of the gold, whether it was ever real. But as he sat there, sharing a simple meal on a mended porch, looking out at a piece of land that had been pulled back from the edge of ruin, he realized it didn't matter. The real treasure wasn't buried in the ground. It was in the quiet dignity of a home, in the shared labor of a neighbor, in the simple, profound act of standing on the right side of a line. It was the kind of wealth a man couldn't steal. He could only earn it, or, if he was lucky, be invited to share in it. Thank you for being here, for staying with this story until the very end. We often think of strength as something loud, a force that imposes its will on the world. But maybe true strength is quieter. Maybe it's found in the person who endures, the one who mends what is broken, the one who simply refuses to be moved from their own small patch of ground. What do you think? Is the greatest courage found in the grand battle, or in the quiet, daily act of holding on to one's dignity? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found value in this story, a like and a subscribe would mean the world to us. It allows us to continue telling stories just like this one. Until next time, be well and be good to one another.